Britain has been on the wrong path for 40 years. It's fair, I think, to say that he means this. The challenge facing him, as with any elected politician, is the forces of inertia. If you see that various parts of government are not clearly aligned with some kind of overall vision, then you could say, no, the forces of obstruction have triumphed. If, on the other hand, you do, that's a sign you are seeing an attempt at radical change. Whether it works or not, that's a different question.
Welcome, everybody, to Unconventional Knowledge, the G.I.S. podcast. I'm Andy Kurth, managing editor at G.I.S. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Steve Davies, Senior Education Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Steve is a historian and the author of several books on political thought, economics, and the forces reshaping modern politics. Britain has a new Prime Minister in Andy Burnham, and today we'll discuss whether his arrival will mark a genuine political reset or simply more of the same. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
So let's just go ahead and jump right in. It's been well reported, a lot of ink has been spilled that Britain has had 7 prime ministers in 10 years. There seems to be at least hope and a bit more chatter that Burnham could be different. But now that he's prime minister, what would really signal that this represents a genuine change, a genuine political reset?
Well, the reason why people think there might be a genuine political reset with Burnham is that because the kind of rhetoric he's been using and the things he's been saying in his public statements. So he's been making statements like Britain has been on the wrong path for 40 years, which implies, if you take him at his word, that he wants to undo a lot of the policies of both the Thatcher government in the 80s and also the Blair and Brown government in the 2000s and thereafter, as well as the subsequent Conservative and coalition governments. Now, the question is, well, is this just words? And it's fair, I think, to say that he means this, but the challenge facing him, as with any elected politician, is the forces of inertia, if you will. The things that tend to block radical change or shifts are very, very powerful. This is one of the big problems that British prime ministers have faced over the last 10, 15 years. They try to do things and they find that it's almost impossible to do them. There are just too many people with veto powers, essentially. So assuming that he does actually mean he wants to make a radical shift, how would we know that this is being carried through? And I think what you would have to see is major change in the 3 obvious areas. Economic policy, the structure of government itself and of public administration, and the nature of the welfare state, because those are the 3 big sort of problematic areas where if he was to undo the policies of both Thatcher and Blair, to put it in that kind of truncated way, he would have to address and make radical changes in those areas. The other thing that I think would indicate that this is a transformative government of the kind that, say, the Thatcher government or the Blair government or the Attlee government, going even further back, were, is if you can see a clear vision or idea, an ideological project, if you will, that is being aimed at, which is then reflected in departmental policy across the board. With those governments I mentioned, those 3 governments, this was very clearly the case. It was very clear that the Attlee government, for example, had a particular vision for a socialist Britain, and that this was reflected in what every single government department did. Similarly with the kind of market reforms of the Thatcher government. So if you don't see that, if you see each department pretty much pursuing its own agenda, or the things that various parts of government are doing are not coordinated and are not clearly aligned with some kind of overall vision, then you could say, no, the forces of obstruction have triumphed and this is not going to be a radical change. If, on the other hand, you do, that's a sign that whether it works or not, that's a different question. You are seeing an attempt at radical change.
That's a really great summary of the things that we can really look for going forward. And when it comes to this reconstitution of the state and aligning the state along a particular vision, one of the phrases that Burnham likes to use, and one of the phrases that his supporters use a lot, is building a productive state. What does that mean?
Good question. We actually have a fairly good idea now, because there is actually a little booklet, short book called The Productive State, which was brought out by 2 of his closest advisors a couple of months before he won the by-election and then became prime minister. And what this idea of the productive state is for a new political economy, one that is different from the so-called, if you want to call it loosely terms, neoliberal economy of the kind that was birthed in the Thatcher years, but then I think actually brought to full fruition under Blair and Brown. The productive state is not socialism. It's important to emphasize that. Burnham likes to talk about business-friendly socialism, which sounds a bit contradictory to many people on both right and left. But what he actually means by that is an economy which is largely privately owned, which is still therefore dominated by private businesses. They're doing most of the work, the actual production, but in which the state has a very active role. And so the idea is that the state will create a kind of third sphere alongside the private market sphere and the welfare state. And this will be about production. So it'll be the state taking on the role of directing investment, not managing that investment or making it directly, but if you like, telling people where they should invest, what sectors they should invest in, and in providing, it's thought, the kind of infrastructure, training, physical support that's needed for other parts of the economy, notably the private part, to become more productive and more profitable. So it's a dirigiste, to use a good French word, model of political economy, one in which an active state plays a direct role without necessarily, or even to any great extent, in my view, having read the book, owning large parts of productive assets. It's more a matter of the state engaging in the kind of indicative planning that you got, say, in France in the 1950s and 60s. I think the model that it's based on is a combination of Japan, stroke South Korea, and China, since Deng Xiaoping's reforms. A very dynamic market economy, but one in which the state is playing a pretty important role in terms of directing economic activity. Now, you may disagree with it. I have strong doubts about this myself, but it's a pretty coherent vision of a different kind of public political economy, economic strategy to what we have had in the last 30, 40 years. One final thing I'd add about this productive state is that there's a big emphasis in it on producing actual physical goods and services as opposed to intangible services. So a kind of subtext to this whole idea is the idea that the British economy should reorient away from financial services, which have been the predominant income-generating sector in the British economy since really the late 1980s, very early 1990s. And so that's another part of it, I think. There's a kind of emphasis on rebuilding or reconstructing, not just manufacturing, but other kinds of service sectors other than what you might call the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, real estate. So that's the other part of this.
Yeah, I agree. It does sound very coherent. That seems positive. And manufacturing, concrete goods, that kind of thing is something that Western economies have missed and something that has caused quite a bit of, maybe not unrest, but some political upheaval throughout the West over the past 20, 30 years. It also sounds like it's edging, or maybe even more toward quite a bit of centralization. So for more business-oriented viewers, readers out there, listeners, that's going to be something to watch very carefully.
Yeah, definitely.
I think. This more active state that you describe, Burnham has made very clear that he wants to create it without significantly burdening taxpayers. But yeah, it seems difficult to do that without either, if you don't raise taxes, cutting programs or more borrowing. Can you explain what the logic is, how he plans to carry this out?
Yes. To respond to your like challenge there, as he, I think, would, if you look at the logic of this productive state strategy, it doesn't necessarily involve, and in fact in many ways shouldn't involve, the state actually laying out lots of money. So if the state, for example, gives very strong guidance for private sector investment, which is a key part of this strategy, that doesn't involve any great expenditure. You've got a few civil servants who are drafting the policies, but they're employed anyway. So a large part of this doesn't actually involve spending that much money. Now, building kind of infrastructure, that does require money, undoubtedly. So there is things like that. Now, also, for example, a lot of people have pointed out correctly that taking things like the water industry into public ownership, which is what has been floated widely at the moment, would be very, very expensive because you'd have to buy out the debt holders, or even if you force them to take a big haircut, you're still talking about a lot of money. However, and this is the key thing to realize, Burnham has quite explicitly made that what he's talking about with things like utilities is government control, not government ownership. So what we're looking at, I think, is a situation where the state will not own things like water companies or utilities of other kinds, such as electricity and the like. But what it will do is basically make them agents of the government rather than freestanding commercial enterprises. They will be basically given, it's not even going to be regulation, they're going to be basically put in a position where their relationship with the state is such that they have to do what the relevant minister tells them to do. And they're no longer a regular kind of commercial company. Now, regardless of what you think about that, that puts a huge amount of burden on the competence of ministers in the British state, which is a bit of a, a big assumption, I think. It doesn't necessarily require money from the state. So I think in his manner of thinking, the only area of the kind of things he wants productive state to do that does require a lot of lashing out of cash by the central state is things like infrastructure. Now, that said, I think that going forward, this Labour government under Burnham is going to have to either raise taxes or make spending cuts. But that's not because of this productive state strategy. That's because of the dire state of the public finances at the moment, and that in turn is mainly down to welfare transfers of various kinds. Above all, spending on, people like me, basically, the elderly, because the combination of pensions, state pensions, plus National Health Service spending, which overwhelmingly goes to the elderly these days, that's the area of government spending that is growing most rapidly and which is going to grow inevitably because we have an aging population. And when you look at the sums, if you like, basically either something is done about that or the government stops doing major things or you put taxes up or some combination of these things. And so, for example, one of his flagship policies has been announced is to create a national care service for social care for the elderly. And he's proposing to fund this out of general taxation with an extra income tax, 1.8% of income above a level, plus a kind of National Health Service style, free at the point of use care service. Personally, I think this is entirely the wrong way to go with addressing an undoubtedly real problem. But leaving that to one side, you can't do this without, as in this case, raising taxes. So I think the government will have to raise taxes or make big cuts, or probably both, actually. But that's not due to this productive state strategy. That's due to the ongoing crisis of the British welfare system.
And has he offered any solutions for this crisis of the welfare system
No,
aside from...
He hasn't yet. And I suspect that this is where there hasn't been a lot of thinking done. Because the problem is that, given the opinions and views of his own MPs, interestingly, not so much his party members, according to recent surveys, but certainly the people who are in Parliament, any measure to, for example, rein in the out-of-control growth of spending on special educational needs or disability payments, so-called PIP payments, would cause severe political backlash from within his own party. So he needs to have a pretty clearly worked out plan for that, which he's then prepared to force through against pretty strong opposition from his own side. And it's not clear yet that he has a clear idea about what he wants to do or how he wants to do it in this area of policy.
Yeah, well, that brings me really nicely to my next question, which is we're talking about all these elements of economic policy and whether he doesn't have a plan for some of these challenges. And you touched on this a little bit before, but isn't there going to have to be some sort of reform of the basic institutions that manage economic policy or that carry out economic policy, like the Treasury, the machinery of government? Isn't he going to have to kind of challenge those institutions rather than simply implement a new policy?
I think he definitely is going to have to. I think actually amongst our political class in general, across all parties, there's a kind of growing realization that the British state is simply dysfunctional. The kind of reforms to the state that the Blair government brought in have, I think, proven to be pretty disastrous. And that combined with the austerity imposed by the coalition government has left the British state in the most bizarre situation of being very large and bloated. It spends just short of 50% of national income, but at the same time being completely incapable of actually doing anything, which is an extraordinary combination when you think about it. The worst of all possible worlds, basically. Now, what this requires is pretty radical reform. It requires probably reform of the departmental structure of government, which we've had ever since the 1920s. Dominic Cummings, who's been a long-standing critic of the way the British state works, has argued for a long time that what you need is to divide the government up into what you might call discrete project areas, and that the departmental structure, with its kind of very stable hierarchy of career progression, is no longer useful. And basically that system was created during the 1920s. So probably have to undo that. You would certainly need to undo the power and control that the Treasury has, or more precisely, the way the Treasury works. Because various parts of the way the Treasury works, like the so-called Green Book, which is the set of criteria for public sector investment, work to concentrate public spending in just one part of the country, which is London, rather than other parts, which goes against the whole core of what Burnham wants to do. And also what the Blair government did was to outsource a lot of administration and public policy to various non-elected bodies, quangos as we call them. And this again is proving to be essentially a job creation scheme for what is rather derisively called the lanyard class. But it means, therefore, that when a minister wants to get something done, you find that you can't do it directly. You've got to work through these detached or semi-detached bodies, which typically have an agenda of their own, which has nothing to do with serving the public in many cases. And so I think, yes, there is going to have to be radical reform. Now, there are signs that he's thinking of doing some things already. So there's been a lot of talk about Number 10 North moving the Prime Minister's office up to Manchester for 2 or 3 days a week. A lot of the commentary has been this is just a media stunt. And I think at the moment that's all it is. But I think it's pretty clear he does have a serious idea about really beefing up the Prime Ministerial office to provide an alternative to the power of the Cabinet Secretary and the Cabinet Office, and to give Number 10, or the Prime Minister, whoever it is, a much larger, more effective kind of staff and office to put their policy into effect. This has been a big problem. And I think it's also pretty clear from the way he's talking about what this Number 10 North will do, that it's about doing an end run, as the Americans say, around the control that the Treasury exercises over departmental budgets and large areas of state spending and state strategy. Now, whether he will follow through on this, the jury's out on that. It's very early days. If he does decide to follow through on this, well, good luck to him. I mean, the British state does need a big shake-up. It's radically dysfunctional, but it is a very big task. I have to be, a bit cautious here and say, yeah, if you can do this, all well and good, but you really are, as we know, if anybody has watched Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, the power of the British civil service to check what politicians want to do is really remarkable. So, he's got a big task in his hands. We will only know in about 2 years' time, I think, whether he actually has embarked upon the kind of radical reform that his own plans, and I think pretty much anybody's plans these days, makes necessary.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that one, on that answer a bit. How does moving the location of where the Prime Minister is, where his the Prime Minister and his office is, how does that help get around these very brittle and entrenched state interests that you were talking about?
This is where I think you need to understand something about the kind of social dynamics of British politics and government. It gets around in 3 ways if it works properly. The first is it simply has the effect of moving a key locus of decision-making, the Prime Ministerial office, away from the very incestuous hothouse world of SW1, as Dominic Cummings calls it, the bit of Westminster where I'm actually sitting at the moment, in fact. And unless you've actually been here, it's hard to grasp just how enclosed and, as I say, incestuous this world is. Everybody's constantly bumping into each other in the same butt. So you break out of that. Secondly, what it does is it means, and this is quite simple, a lot of people who work at the moment in Westminster and civil service have been told, oh, you're going to have to go up to Manchester. And their response is, oh my God, I don't want to go to Manchester. That's like the back of beyond. And so what happens is they're going to be told, I imagine, no, if you don't do this, then you lose your job. You're being given a direct instruction to change your place of work. If you don't want to do this, fine, thank you and goodbye. And you recruit new people. So it's a way of bringing in new people into the senior levels of the state. The third thing is what the briefing that this Number 10 North has got, which is basically to run the kind of devolution and regional policy. And that's the area where needing to face down the Treasury and the central kind of command and control system of British state spending is most acute. And so that's why I think this is more than just a publicity stunt. You can bet that there's going to be huge pushback, but he does seem to be very determined to do this.
That's fascinating. Thanks for explaining that. One area of policy that we haven't quite got to yet that has been very important and a big part of what Burnham has talked about is energy. And he talks a lot about lowering energy costs. But I know that there's this tension within the British government and between the parties about net zero and whether those goals should be maintained or whether they should be discarded. And there seems to be some people who favor either of those options on both sides, right? So can you explain, can he lower those energy costs while still maintaining this net zero timetable that he's got?
Well, almost certainly not. The thing is this, that at the moment, renewable energy is becoming cheaper and cheaper. But the trouble is, in the British context, this would be different if we were closer to the equator. But where we are, you can't simply rely on renewable energy for your electricity generation. You need to have a reliable backstop for when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, basically. You also need major investment in the grid in order to make the grid able to handle this kind of surges or drops in power that you get with wind power in particular, which because of our location is what we mostly rely on. So it's very expensive to move to net zero in that way. Plus, this you can argue about whether it is realistically net zero, but that's another story. Now, what that means, therefore, is that in order to bring down energy costs, given that there's all these big capital costs involved, you basically have to either move away to a different energy strategy or spread it out over a much longer time period. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty difficult to get the cost down. One way you could get the cost down is by delinking the price of retail electricity from the price of gas. At the moment, it's the price of gas that determines what the end consumer pays. That's because gas is the backup fuel for when the renewable energy isn't coming online. So it makes sense to do it that way. The problem is that gas is currently pretty expensive because of the war in the Gulf and other things, and also the war in Ukraine, which has cut us off from the major source of cheap gas here in Europe, as you know. And so what that means, therefore, is that as long as you have that link, electricity is going to be expensive. He could cut that link. That would be a simple administrative change. But that would almost certainly mean moving away from net zero as a kind of explicit policy goal. There is the question also of drilling in the North Sea. Now, Burnham has said that he is going to grant drilling licenses for a couple of oil and gas fields where the previous Conservative government had already approved a license. It was frozen when the Labour Party came in. He said he's going to lift that freeze and let it go ahead. And probably, I think, going down the line, he will open up the North Sea more. That is going to be a help. It's certainly a good thing, but it's not actually going to reduce energy costs that much, simply because North Sea production is on the downward slope of the Hubbard curve. Basically, the economics of depletion are kicking in. North Sea oil and gas fields are steadily depleting, which means that the marginal cost of producing from them, the cost of each additional barrel of oil or unit of gas that comes out of it is going to go up. And that means that it's an increasingly high cost production. So it would help at the margin, certainly doesn't do any harm, but you can't look to the North Sea, as some people do, as a kind of magic tap that you can turn on to bring down energy costs.
Right. One thing another thing that we mentioned earlier was this idea of devolution, that Burnham wants to give more power kind of to local administrations.
Yeah.
And he comes from Labour's left, and this idea of devolution, well, it strikes me as a more kind of conservative idea. So can you explain how these ideas fit together?
Well, okay. First of all, I'm not so sure that it's fair to say that Burnham comes from the left of the Labour Party. He's rather had a kind of
Okay.
chameleon-like political career. He's been various things. He's been a Blairite, he's been a soft left person, he's been a Brownite, he's been a whole number of things, whatever would advance his career, basically. I think, to be fair to him, he has, since during the time he's been outside Westminster, off in Manchester, he has developed a pretty strong vision of government to which devolution is a key thing. So I think his background no longer is relevant here. I also wouldn't say necessarily that devolution is a conservative thing. The British Conservative Party, ever since the 1880s, really has favoured a unitary British state. It's really a classical liberal idea that we should have marked devolution. Now, what I think is becoming very clear is that Burnham has the idea that there should be lots of powers given to regional mayors based on major cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, the North East, Leeds, that kind of thing. However, it becomes clear that he sees these as almost like branch offices whose job and function is to deliver the same policy everywhere, just with perhaps local tweaks. Now, that completely ignores the reality of what a truly federal devolved system would be. Because if you had a truly federal devolved system, you'd have, different places, like say Liverpool and Manchester, trying out completely different policies. That's part of the benefit of it. This is why things work in the United States. It means that as the states are the laboratories of democracy, in the famous expression, and you can see what works in one place, Texas, for example, and doesn't work in another place, California. But if all these different devolved mayors, with all their authority, are still carrying out broadly the same policy, it's just a matter of delivery with a bit of local tweaks. That's not true decentralization. Plus, he's said that he wants the same kind of results, prosperity in every postcode. And again, that defeats the whole object. You can't do that with genuine local autonomy, because some people are going to make mistakes if you have genuine autonomy, and those areas will do less well than the ones that make good decisions. You can see this at a local level now with Manchester and Liverpool, where until recently Liverpool was doing very badly, Manchester was doing very well because Manchester's Labour leadership had made good decisions, Liverpool's had made bad decisions. Now, the point is, he doesn't seem to want that. He seems to think that we should have the same result. The only way you can get that is by transferring resources from the more successful, prosperous areas to the less successful, less prosperous areas. And that, again, is incompatible with a truly devolved or federal system of government. So I think he has an idea about devolving administration, but there's no real devolution of actual political choice to these regional areas. So it's not like, say, the German Lander. Although he says he's influenced by this, he clearly doesn't understand how it works, because, as you well know, German Lander have much greater autonomy in terms of the policy that they follow, and this would imply.
Yeah. It even sounds like it introduces an element of moral hazard, the way you put it, right? That the regions that do poorly still benefit, and the regions that do well end up having to transfer their resources.
That's precisely
to
the
those
problem.
other regions.
And the other thing I would say, by the way, and this is something where you can say rude things about both the big political parties in Britain, is that neither of our major parties is prepared to accept that if you have decentralized government, your opponents will be in power some of the time in some of these devolved regions and able to use the power that gives them to do things you don't like. If you're a Democrat and you believe in a federal decentralized system, you just take that on the chin. That's a feature, not a bug. But neither of our big parties is really prepared to accept it. They like the idea that when you get control of Westminster, you get control of the whole country, the whole ball of wax, as the Americans say. And that mindset is still very much there, I think.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Well, we've spent this whole time talking about domestic policy, and I want to get a little bit to foreign policy and how Burnham's leadership could potentially affect Britain's place in Europe and the world, its various relationships. Obviously, a crucial relationship for the UK is its relationship with the European Union. What kind of relationship, what should we expect any sort of change? Closer relations further away? How does he approach relations?
This is a very
with the
interesting
European
question.
Union?
I'm not sure the government itself and Burnham himself knows yet what the answer is going to be, because he's facing two quite different pressures, and it'll be interesting to see which one wins out. On the one hand, there's no doubt a large part of British industry and British agriculture would dearly like to see closer relations between Britain and the EU, and in particular, closer regulatory harmonisation through, if not overtly rejoining the single market regime, aligning Britain very, very closely with it, so that all the kind of paperwork they now have to deal with whenever they export to the EU or import from it is done away with. At the same time, within his own party and what you might call the wider centre-left ecosystem, there's really powerful pressure for, at the very least, a rapprochement with Europe. On the other hand, a lot of the things he wants to do are not compatible, or the way he wants to do them, rather, are not compatible with EU membership or close alignment. So just today, for example, he's announced radical changes to the way the government procurement system works, in a way that will mean they will favour domestic producers. He's basically scrapped a whole array of tags and rules that govern how the government makes its procurement decisions. Now, the point about this policy, which Jeremy Corbyn advocated, by the way, is that it's not compatible with being in the EU single market regime, because it's banned as a form of state aid to domestic industry. Now, okay, in some ways that's a joke, because we know perfectly well that the French government, for example, is doing stuff like this all the time. But the British, with their kind of legalistic mindset, have always stuck very rigidly to the rules, and the rules do ban this. So a lot of this productive strategy we were talking about is not compatible with EU membership. It can be only, or even single market membership, it can only be done if you take advantage of the greater regulatory independence that leaving the EU and becoming more distant from it brought. And so he's going to be pulled in two directions. A lot of political incentives, and also incentives for trying to unbung a lot of Britain's trade relations with Europe will pull them in the direction of closer alignment with Europe. But on the other hand, the overall strategy he clearly wants to follow for economics, I think, rules against that. And so it's a question of which of those two forces will win out. And we obviously won't know for about a year or so. I suspect that what will happen is that you'll get very, very piecemeal adjustments to bring certain sectors, perhaps notably agriculture, closer into line with EU regulations, because that might not be incompatible with the broader strategy he's got. But that, as becomes obvious to the government, that they can't pursue the goals they want for reindustrialization or changing the basis of the British economy away from finance, that they can't do that using things like government procurement without falling foul of the regulations they'd have to align with, that they will actually start limiting the areas of rapprochement. So I'm increasingly of the view that I would bet, probably about 5-4, that actually the approach to Europe will be much less marked than many people in his own party hope and expect.
Very interesting. Obviously, the other crucial relationship for the UK is its special relationship with the United States. Been under a lot of strain over the past several years. How do you expect Burnham to approach relations with the United States, also NATO, and the kind of broader international scene?
Foreign defence and security policy is one of those areas where, for very good reasons, you don't normally have it as an object of political contestation between the two major parties. It's very, very unusual to have an election where the two parties take differing positions on this. Hardly ever happens. And there are reasons for this. You want to have a consensus on these areas, and there is a kind of elite consensus about it. So what I think you should say here is it doesn't really matter what Burnham himself says. Obviously it matters some because he's Prime Minister, but that's not crucial here. What is crucial rather is the debate that goes on within the British security class, the senior security officers and soldiers, the civil servants, the diplomats, the politicians, the rest of them. And I think at the moment there's, behind closed doors and under Chatham House rules, a whole lot of pretty heavy discussions going on. The one big one is should we just wait until Donald Trump leaves the scene and hope that he's a kind of aberration and the relationship with the US, which has dominated British policy since 1940, can go back to where it was? A lot of people desperately hope this is true, but I think there's an increasing body of opinion amongst our security elite, if you will, that actually this is not going to happen. He could be succeeded by J.D. Vance, for example, who has a much more explicit kind of skepticism towards NATO, hostility to large commitments outside the Western Hemisphere than Trump does. And so there's also all the people who vote for the Republicans. So even the Democrats get back into power. As soon as the Republicans regain power, you have to expect that there's going to be a reversion back to the Trump model. So I think a lot of people are thinking we can't trust the Americans anymore. And that means you need to make pretty radical choices or think very radically about how Britain's security policy should work, whether or not NATO actually has a meaningful future. That logically implies, I think, a much closer security relationship with European countries, notably Germany and France, particularly France, but also Germany, other European countries like Spain, Poland, the Baltic states, even Hungary or Central European countries. And so I think we'll see a lot of that going forward. And this does raise all kinds of huge questions like common procurement policy. You can't have an effective pan-European defense or even diplomatic strategy unless it's underpinned by a common procurement strategy, because otherwise you're going to waste a ton of money. One of the reasons why the Americans can, have the world's largest military is because, there's only one procurement and defense policy. It's not split up between 20 odd member states the way it is in Europe. So there's all kinds of big questions that come out of that, and how you coordinate the diplomatic strategies of a lot of different countries, which have, in many cases, quite different diplomatic interests, with regard to relations with Russia, for example, or with, say, the Maghreb states, places like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversations going on in the background. And over the next 3 to 4 years, I think, and particularly after the next federal election in the United States, I think you'll probably see some pretty major shifts. The final aspect of this is the revolution in warfare that has clearly happened during the war in Ukraine. I think what has happened is that war has massively accelerated in the way that wars do, a complete transformation of military technology, which is making war a very different kind of activity to what it's been for the last 150 years, really, or even longer. And amongst other things, it means that things like a lot of the advanced kit militaries now have weapons platforms like surface warships, aircraft, attack aircraft, tanks, armored vehicles. Basically, these are now obsolescent, if not obsolete. They're sitting ducks for drone attacks. Submarines, absolutely not. They're still highly valuable. But a lot of the stuff that people have spent a fortune on, we've suddenly realized these just aren't up to scratch. And this means you need to completely rethink at a very radical level what your military looks like. What does your army look like when you're in a world of warfare where as soon as a soldier in a war zone sticks their head quite literally out of a foxhole, it's blown off by a drone in a kind of killing zone. You need to quite radically rethink what's going on. And so I think that regardless of the Prime Minister, you're going to see a pretty big reorientation of the defense policy and strategy of pretty much, and the security strategy of pretty much every European state. One final area, and I'll finish on this, is that I think you are going to see a major focus going forward, and I think you already are, in the security services on information warfare and what you might call cultural warfare, the kind of thing that Russia is practicing a lot of at the moment. The use of social media to try and destabilize the politics of different countries, or to feed lots of completely bogus and false information, not to mislead people, but to destroy the very idea of truth. And so I think you're going to see a big shift in focus towards how combating this, and also providing online security, which is aimed as much very often at criminals as it is against state agents, although there's an interesting overlap between the two categories here. So that's another area where I think you're going to see a lot more attention and effort being made, and not just by the British. I mean, I think this is a problem for European states in general.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Well, you've given us really a lot to think about, a lot to watch for, and how Burnham's premiership develops is absolutely something that's going to be really crucial for geopolitics and geoeconomics as we go forward. So that is unfortunately all we have time for today. But Steve, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your
My
thoughts.
pleasure. Thank you very much.
And thanks to everyone for listening and watching. You can read Steve's reports and find more analysis from GIS experts at gisreportsonline.com. Until next time, thanks for joining us and take care. That's it for this episode of Unconventional Knowledge, a podcast from Geopolitical Intelligence Services. Thank you for listening. New episodes are released on the first Monday of every month, so subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to stay updated. For more analysis on global affairs with a detailed focus on future scenarios, visit gisreportsonline.com. And if you'd like to explore how any of the trends discussed today could affect your business or industry, email us at advisory@gis.li for a consultation or a custom report. We'll see you next month.